Warren Gamaliel Harding, November 2, 1865 – August 2, 1923, was an American politician who served as the 29th President of the United States from March 4, 1921 until his death in 1923. At the time of his death, Harding was one of the most popular presidents, but the subsequent exposure of scandals that took place under his administration such as Teapot Dome eroded his popular regard, as did revelations of an affair by Nan Britton, one of his mistresses. In historical rankings of the U.S. presidents, Harding is often rated among the worst. Harding lived in rural Ohio all his life, except when political service took him elsewhere. As a young man, he bought the Marion Star, building it into a successful newspaper. In 1899, he was elected to the Ohio State Senate and after 4 years there successfully ran for lieutenant governor. He was defeated for governor in 1910, but was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1914. When Harding ran for the Republican nomination for president in 1920, he was considered a long shot until after the convention began. Then the leading candidates, such as General Leonard Wood, could not gain the needed majority and the convention deadlocked. Harding's support gradually grew until he was nominated on the 10th ballot. He conducted a front porch campaign, remaining for the most part in Marion and allowing the people to come to him. He won in a landslide over Democrat James M. Cox and Socialist Party candidate Eugene Debs, running on a theme of return to normalcy and becoming the first sitting U.S. Senator to be elected president. Harding appointed a number of well-regarded figures to his cabinet, including Andrew Mellon at the Treasury, Herbert Hoover at Commerce and Charles Evans Hughes at the State Department. A major foreign policy achievement came with the Washington Naval Conference of 1921–1922, in which the world's major naval powers agreed on a naval limitations program that lasted a decade. 2 members of his cabinet were implicated in corruption: Interior Secretary Albert Fall and Attorney General Harry Doherty. The resulting scandals did not fully emerge until after Harding's death, nor did word of his extramarital affairs, but both greatly damaged his reputation. Harding died of a heart attack in San Francisco while on a Western-speaking tour, and was succeeded by his vice president, Calvin Coolidge. Early life and career. Childhood and education. Harding was born November 2, 1865, in Blooming Grove, Ohio. Nicknamed Winnie as a small child, Harding was the eldest of 8 children born to George Tryon Harding, 1843–1928, usually known as Tryon, and Phoebe Elizabeth, née Dickerson, Harding, 1843–1910. Phoebe was a state-licensed midwife. Tryon farmed and taught school near Mount Gilead, Ohio. Through apprenticeship, study, and a year of medical school, Tryon became a doctor and started a small practice. Some of Harding's mother's ancestors were Dutch, including the well-known Van Kirk family. Harding also had ancestors from England, Wales, and Scotland. It was rumored by a political opponent in Blooming Grove that one of Harding's great-grandmothers was African American. His great-great-grandfather Amos Harding claimed that a thief, who had been caught in the act by the family, started the rumor in an attempt at extortion or revenge. After Warren Harding's death in 1923, some African Americans continued to claim he had black ethnicity. This issue was resolved in 2015. Genetic testing of Harding's descendants determined, with more than a 95% chance of accuracy, that he lacked sub-Saharan African forebears within 4 generations. In 1870, the Harding family, who were abolitionists, moved to Caledonia, Ohio, where Tryon acquired the Argus, a local weekly newspaper. At the Argus, Harding, from the age of 11, learned the basics of the newspaper business. In late 1879, at the age of 14, Harding enrolled at his father's alma mater, Ohio Central College in Iberia, where he proved an adept student. He and a friend put out a small newspaper, the Iberia Spectator, during their final year at Ohio Central, intended to appeal to both college and town. During his final year, the Harding family moved to Marion, Ohio, about 6 miles, 9.7 kilometers, from Caledonia, and when he graduated in 1882, he joined them there. Editor. In Harding's youth, the majority of the population still lived on farms and in small towns. He would spend much of his life in Marion, a small city in rural Ohio, and would become closely associated with it. When Harding rose to high office, he made clear his love of Marion and its way of life, telling of the many young Marionites who had left and enjoyed success elsewhere, while suggesting that the man, once the pride of the school, who had remained behind and become a janitor, was the happiest one of the lot. Upon graduating, Harding had stints as a teacher and as an insurance man, and made a brief attempt at studying law. He then raised $300 in partnership with others to purchase a failing newspaper, the Marion Star, weakest of the growing city's 3 papers, and its only daily. The 18-year-old Harding used the railroad pass that came with the paper to attend the 1884 Republican National Convention, where he hobnobbed with better-known journalists and supported the presidential nominee, former Secretary of State James G. Blaine. Harding returned from Chicago to find that the paper had been reclaimed by the sheriff. During the election campaign, Harding worked for the Marion Democratic Mirror and was annoyed at having to praise the Democratic presidential nominee, New York Governor Grover Cleveland, who won the election. Afterward, with the financial aid of his father, the budding newspaperman redeemed the paper. Through the later years of the 1880s, Warren Harding built the Star. The city of Marion tended to vote Republican, as did Ohio, but Marion County was Democratic. Accordingly, Harding adopted a tempered editorial stance, declaring the Daily Star nonpartisan and circulating a weekly edition that was moderate Republican. This policy attracted advertisers and put the town's Republican weekly out of business. According to his biographer, Andrew Sinclair, the success of Harding with the Star was certainly in the model of Horatio Alger. He started with nothing, and through working, stalling, bluffing, withholding payments, borrowing back wages, boasting, and manipulating, he turned a dying rag into a powerful small-town newspaper. Much of his success had to do with his good looks, affability, enthusiasm, and persistence, but he was also lucky. As Machiavelli once pointed out, cleverness will take a man far, but he cannot do without good fortune. The population of Marion grew from 4,000 in 1880 to twice that in 1890, increasing to 12,000 by 1900. This growth helped the Star, and Harding did his best to promote the city, purchasing stock in many local enterprises. Although a few of these turned out badly, he was in general successful as an investor, leaving an estate of $850,000 in 1923. According to Harding biographer and former White House counsel John Dean, Harding's civic influence was that of an activist who used his editorial page to effectively keep his nose and a prodding voice in all the town's public business. To date, Harding is the only U.S. president to have had journalism experience. He became an ardent supporter of Governor Joseph B. Foraker, a Republican. Harding first came to know Florence Kling, 5 years older than he, as the daughter of a local banker and developer. Amos Kling was a man accustomed to getting his way, but Harding attacked him relentlessly in the paper. Amos involved Florence in all his affairs, taking her to work from the time she could walk. As hard-headed as her father, Florence came into conflict with him after returning from music college. After she eloped with Pete Dewulf, and returned to Marion without Dewulf, but with an infant called Marshall, Amos agreed to raise the boy, but would not support Florence, who made a living as a piano teacher. One of her students was Harding's sister Charity. By 1886, Florence Kling had obtained a divorce, and she and Warren Harding were courting, though who was pursuing whom is uncertain, depending on who later told the story of their romance. A truce between the Klings was snuffed out by the budding match. Amos believed that the Hardings had African American blood, and was also offended by Harding's editorial stances. He started to spread rumors of Harding's supposed black heritage and encouraged local businessmen to boycott Harding's business interests. When Harding found out what Kling was doing, he warned Kling that he would beat the tar out of the little man if he didn't cease. The Hardings were married on July 8, 1891 at their new home on Mount Vernon Avenue in Marion, which they had designed together in the Queen Anne style. The marriage produced no children. Warren Harding affectionately called his wife the Duchess, based on a character in a serial from the New York Sun, in which the Duchess kept a close eye on the Duke and their money, running anything that required efficiency. Florence Harding became deeply involved in her husband's career, both at the Star and once he entered politics. Exhibiting her father's determination and business sense, she helped turn the Star into a profitable enterprise through her tight management of the paper's circulation department. She has been credited with helping Harding achieve more than he might have alone. Some have suggested that she pushed him all the way to the White House. Start in politics. Soon after purchasing the Star, Harding turned his attention to politics, supporting Foraker in his first successful bid for governor in 1885. Foraker was part of the war generation that challenged older Ohio Republicans, such as Senator John Sherman, for control of state politics. Harding, always a party loyalist, supported Foraker in the complex internecine warfare that was Ohio Republican politics. Harding was willing to tolerate Democrats, as necessary to a two-party system, but had only contempt for those who bolted the Republican Party to join third-party movements. He was a delegate to the Republican State Convention in 1888, at the age of 22, representing Marion County, and would be elected a delegate in most years until becoming president. Harding's success as an editor took a toll on his health. 5 times between 1889, when he was 23, and 1901, he spent time at the Battle Creek Sanatorium for reasons Sinclair described as fatigue, overstrain, and nervous illnesses. Dean ties these visits to early occurrences of the heart ailment that would kill Harding in 1923. During one such absence from Marion, in 1894, the Star's business manager quit. Florence Harding took his place. She became her husband's top assistant at the Star on the business side, maintaining her role until the Hardings moved to Washington in 1915. Her assistant's incompetence allowed Warren Harding to travel to make speeches. His use of the free railroad pass increased greatly after his marriage. Florence Harding made sure no cents escaped her, sometimes sending Warren to the bank with a gallon, 3.8 liters, bucket full in each hand, and wrote of her husband, "He does well when he listens to me and poorly when he does not." In 1892, Harding traveled to Washington, where he met Democratic Nebraska Congressman William Jennings Bryan, and listened to the boy orator of the Platte speak on the floor of the House of Representatives. Harding traveled to Chicago's Columbian Exposition in 1893. Both visits were without Florence. Democrats generally won Marion County's offices. When Harding ran for auditor in 1895, he lost, but did better than expected. The following year, Harding was one of many orators who spoke across Ohio as part of the campaign of the Republican presidential candidate, that state's former governor, William McKinley. According to Dean, while working for McKinley began making a name for himself through Ohio. Rising politician, 1897–1919. State Senator. Harding wished to try again for elective office. Though a longtime admirer of Foraker, by then a U.S. Senator, he had been careful to maintain good relations with the party faction led by the state's other U.S. Senator, Mark Hanna, McKinley's political manager and chairman of the Republican National Committee, RNC. Both Foraker and Hanna supported Harding for state Senate in 1899. He gained the Republican nomination and was easily elected to a 2-year term. Harding began his 4 years as a state senator as a political unknown. He ended them as one of the most popular figures in the Ohio Republican Party. He always appeared calm and displayed humility, characteristics that endeared him to fellow Republicans even as he passed them in his political rise. Legislative leaders consulted him on difficult problems. It was usual at that time for state senators in Ohio to serve only one term, but Harding gained renomination in 1901. After the assassination of McKinley in September, he was succeeded by Vice President Theodore Roosevelt. Much of the appetite for politics was temporarily lost in Ohio. In November, Harding won a second term, more than doubling his margin of victory to 3,563 votes. Like most politicians of his time, Harding accepted that patronage and graft would be used to repay political favors. He arranged for his sister Mary, who was legally blind, to be appointed as a teacher at the Ohio School for the Blind, although there were better qualified candidates. In another trade, he offered publicity in his newspaper in exchange for free railroad passes for himself and his family. According to Sinclair, it is doubtful that Harding ever thought there was anything dishonest in accepting the perquisites of position or office. Patronage and favors seemed the normal reward for party service in the days of Hanna. Soon after Harding's initial election as senator, he met Harry M. Doherty, who would take a major role in his political career. A perennial candidate for office who served 2 terms in the State House of Representatives in the early 1890s, Doherty had become a political fixer and lobbyist in the state capital of Columbus. After first meeting and talking with Harding, Doherty commented, "Gee, what a great-looking president he'd make." Ohio State Leader. In early 1903, Harding announced he would run for governor of Ohio, prompted by the withdrawal of the leading candidate, Congressman Charles Dick. Hanna and George Cox felt that Harding was not electable due to his work with Foraker as the Progressive era commenced. The public was starting to take a dimmer view of the trading of political favors and of bosses such as Cox. Accordingly, they persuaded Cleveland banker Myron T. Herrick, a friend of McKinley's, to run. Herrick was also better placed to take votes away from the likely Democratic candidate, reforming Cleveland Mayor Tom L. Johnson. With little chance at the gubernatorial nomination, Harding sought nomination as lieutenant governor, and both Herrick and Harding were nominated by acclamation. Foraker and Hanna, who died of typhoid fever in February 1904, both campaigned for what was dubbed the 4-H ticket. Herrick and Harding won by overwhelming margins. Once he and Harding were inaugurated, Herrick made ill-advised decisions that turned crucial Republican constituencies against him, alienating farmers by opposing the establishment of an agricultural college. On the other hand, according to Sinclair, Harding had little to do, and he did it very well. His responsibility to preside over the state Senate allowed him to increase his growing network of political contacts. Harding and others envisioned a successful gubernatorial run in 1905, but Herrick refused to stand aside. In early 1905, Harding announced he would accept nomination as governor if offered, but faced with the anger of leaders such as Cox, Foraker, and Dick, Hanna's replacement in the Senate, announced he would seek no office in 1905. Herrick was defeated, but his new running mate, Andrew L. Harris, was elected, and succeeded as governor after 5 months in office on the death of Democrat John M. Pattison. One Republican official wrote to Harding, "Aren't you sorry Dick wouldn't let you run for lieutenant governor?" In addition to helping pick a president, Ohio voters in 1908 were to choose the legislators who would decide whether to re-elect Foraker. The senator had quarreled with President Roosevelt over the Brownsville affair. Though Foraker had little chance of winning, he sought the Republican presidential nomination against his fellow Cincinnatian, Secretary of War William Howard Taft, who was Roosevelt's chosen successor. On January 6, 1908, Harding's Star endorsed Foraker and upbraided Roosevelt for trying to destroy the senator's career over a matter of conscience. On January 22, Harding in the Star reversed course and declared for Taft, deeming Foraker defeated. According to Sinclair, Harding's change to Taft was not because he saw the light but because he felt the heat. Jumping on the Taft bandwagon allowed Harding to survive his patron's disaster. Foraker failed to gain the presidential nomination, and was defeated for a third term as senator. Also helpful in saving Harding's career was the fact that he was popular with, and had done favors for, the more progressive forces that now controlled the Ohio Republican Party. Harding sought and gained the 1910 Republican gubernatorial nomination. At that time, the party was deeply divided between progressive and conservative wings, and could not defeat the United Democrats. He lost the election to incumbent Judson Harmon. Harry Doherty managed Harding's campaign, but the defeated candidate did not hold the loss against him. Despite the growing rift between them, both President Taft and former President Roosevelt came to Ohio to campaign for Harding, but their quarrels split the Republican Party and helped assure Harding's defeat. The party split grew, and in 1912, Taft and Roosevelt were rivals for the Republican nomination. The 1912 Republican National Convention was bitterly divided. At Taft's request, Harding gave a speech nominating the president, but the angry delegates were not receptive to Harding's oratory. Taft was renominated, but Roosevelt supporters bolted the party. Harding, as a loyal Republican, supported Taft. The Republican vote was split between Taft, the party's official candidate, and Roosevelt, running under the label of the Progressive Party. This allowed the Democratic candidate, New Jersey Governor Woodrow Wilson, to be elected U.S. Senator. Election of 1914. Congressman Theodore Burton had been elected as senator in Foraker's place in 1909, and announced that he would seek a second term in the 1914 elections. By this time, the 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution had been ratified, giving the people the right to elect senators, and Ohio had instituted primary elections for the office. Foraker and former Congressman Ralph D. Cole also entered the Republican primary. When Burton withdrew, Foraker became the favorite, but his old guard republicanism was deemed outdated, and Harding was urged to enter the race. Doherty claimed credit for persuading Harding to run. "I found him like a turtle sunning himself on a log, and I pushed him into the water." According to Harding biographer Randolph Downs, he put on a campaign of such sweetness and light as would have won the plaudits of the angels. It was calculated to offend nobody except Democrats. Although Harding did not attack Foraker, his supporters had no such scruples. Harding won the primary by 12,000 votes over Foraker. Harding's general election opponent was Ohio Attorney General Timothy Hogan, who had risen to statewide office despite widespread prejudice against Roman Catholics in rural areas. In 1914, the start of World War I and the prospect of a Catholic senator from Ohio increased nativist sentiment. Propaganda sheets with names like the Menace and the Defender contained warnings that Hogan was the vanguard in a plot led by Pope Benedict XV through the Knights of Columbus to control Ohio. Harding did not attack Hogan, an old friend, on this or most other issues, but he did not denounce the nativist hatred for his opponent. Harding's conciliatory campaigning style aided him. One Harding friend deemed the candidate's stump speech during the 1914 fall campaign as a rambling, high-sounding mixture of platitudes, patriotism, and pure nonsense. Dean notes, Harding used his oratory to good effect, it got him elected, making as few enemies as possible in the process. Harding won by over 100,000 votes in a landslide that also swept into office a Republican governor, Frank B. Willis, Jr. Senator. When Harding joined the U.S. Senate, the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress, and were led by President Wilson. As a junior senator in the minority, Harding received unimportant committee assignments, but carried out those duties assiduously. He was a safe, conservative, Republican vote. As during his time in the Ohio Senate, Harding came to be widely liked. On two issues, women's suffrage and the prohibition of alcohol, where picking the wrong side would have damaged his presidential prospects in 1920, he prospered by taking nuanced positions. As senator-elect, he indicated that he could not support votes for women until Ohio did. Increased support for suffrage there and among Senate Republicans meant that by the time Congress voted on the issue, Harding was a firm supporter. Harding, who drank, initially voted against banning alcohol. He voted for the 18th Amendment, which imposed prohibition, after successfully moving to modify it by placing a time limit on ratification, which was expected to kill it. Once it was ratified anyway, Harding voted to override Wilson's veto of the Volstead Bill, which implemented the amendment, assuring the support of the Anti-Saloon League. Harding, as a politician respected by both Republicans and progressives, was asked to be temporary chairman of the 1916 Republican National Convention and to deliver the keynote address. He urged delegates to stand as a united party. The convention nominated Justice Charles Evans Hughes. Harding reached out to Roosevelt once the former president declined the 1916 progressive nomination, a refusal that effectively scuttled that party. In the November 1916 presidential election, despite increasing Republican unity, Hughes was narrowly defeated by Wilson. Harding spoke and voted in favor of the resolution of war requested by Wilson in April 1917 that plunged the United States into World War I. In August, Harding argued for giving Wilson almost dictatorial powers, stating that democracy had little place in time of war. Harding voted for most war legislation, including the Espionage Act of 1917, which restricted civil liberties, though he opposed the excess profits tax as anti-business. In May 1918, Harding, less enthusiastic about Wilson, opposed a bill to expand the president's powers. In the 1918 midterm congressional elections, held just before the armistice, Republicans narrowly took control of the Senate. Harding was appointed to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Wilson took no senators with him to the Paris Peace Conference, confident that he could force what became the Treaty of Versailles through the Senate by appealing to the people. When he returned with a single treaty establishing both peace and a League of Nations, the country was overwhelmingly on his side. Many senators disliked Article X of the League Covenant, that committed signatories to the defense of any member nation that was attacked, seeing it as forcing the United States to war without the assent of Congress. Harding was one of 39 senators who signed a round-robin letter opposing the League. When Wilson invited the Foreign Relations Committee to the White House to informally discuss the treaty, Harding ably questioned Wilson about Article X. The president evaded his inquiries. The Senate debated Versailles in September 1919, and Harding made a major speech against it. By then, Wilson had suffered a stroke while on a speaking tour. With an incapacitated president in the White House and less support in the country, the treaty was defeated. Presidential election of 1920. Primary campaign. With most progressives having rejoined the Republican Party, their former leader, Theodore Roosevelt, was deemed likely to make a third run for the White House in 1920, and was the overwhelming favorite for the Republican nomination. These plans ended when Roosevelt suddenly died on January 6, 1919. A number of candidates quickly emerged, including General Leonard Wood, Illinois Governor Frank Lowden, California Senator Hiram Johnson, and a host of relatively minor possibilities such as Herbert Hoover, renowned for his World War I relief work, Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge, and General John J. Pershing. Harding, while he wanted to be president, was as much motivated in entering the race by his desire to keep control of Ohio Republican politics, enabling his re-election to the Senate in 1920. Among those coveting Harding's seat were former Governor Willis, he had been defeated by James M. Cox in 1916, and Colonel William Cooper Proctor, head of Procter & Gamble. On December 17, 1919, Harding made a low-key announcement of his presidential candidacy. Leading Republicans disliked Wood and Johnson, both of the progressive faction of the party, and Lowden, who had an independent streak, was deemed little better. Harding was far more acceptable to the old guard leaders of the party. Doherty, who became Harding's campaign manager, was sure none of the other candidates could garner a majority. His strategy was to make Harding an acceptable choice to delegates once the leaders faltered. Doherty established a Harding for President campaign office in Washington, run by his confidant, Jess Smith, and worked to manage a network of Harding friends and supporters, including Frank Scobie of Texas, clerk of the Ohio State Senate during Harding's years there. Harding worked to shore up his support through incessant letter writing. Despite the candidate's work, according to Russell, without Doherty's Mephistophelian efforts, Harding would never have stumbled forward to the nomination. There were only 16 presidential primary states in 1920, of which the most crucial to Harding was Ohio. Harding had to have some loyalists at the convention to have any chance of nomination, and the Wood campaign hoped to knock Harding out of the race by taking Ohio. Wood campaigned in the state, and his supporter, Proctor, spent large sums. Harding spoke in the non-confrontational style he had adopted in 1914. Harding and Doherty were so confident of sweeping Ohio's 48 delegates that the candidate went on to the next state, Indiana, before the April 27 Ohio primary. Harding carried Ohio by only 15,000 votes over Wood, taking less than half the total vote, and won only 39 of 48 delegates. In Indiana, Harding finished fourth, with less than 10% of the vote, and failed to win a single delegate. He was willing to give up and have Doherty file his nomination papers for the Senate, but Florence Harding grabbed the phone from his hand. "Warren Harding, what are you doing? Give up? Not until the convention is over. Think of your friends in Ohio." On learning that Doherty had left the phone line, the future First Lady retorted, "Well, you tell Harry Doherty for me that we're in this fight until hell freezes over." After he recovered from the shock of the poor results, Harding traveled to Boston, where he delivered a speech that, according to Dean, would resonate throughout the 1920 campaign and history. There, he stated that America's present need is not heroics, but healing, not nostrums, but normalcy, not revolution, but restoration. Dean notes, Harding, more than the other aspirants, was reading the nation's pulse correctly. Convention. The 1920 Republican National Convention opened at the Chicago Coliseum on June 8, 1920, assembling delegates who were bitterly divided, most recently over the results of a Senate investigation into campaign spending, which had just been released. That report found that Wood had spent $1.8 million, lending substance to Johnson's claims that Wood was trying to buy the presidency. Some of the $600,000 that Lowden had spent had wound up in the pockets of two convention delegates. Johnson had spent $194,000 and Harding $113,000. Johnson was deemed to be behind the inquiry, and the rage of the Loughton and Wood factions put an end to any possible compromise among the frontrunners. Of the almost 1,000 delegates, 27 were women. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, guaranteeing women the vote, was within one state of ratification, and would pass before the end of August. The convention had no boss. Most uninstructed delegates voted as they pleased, and with a Democrat in the White House, the party's leaders could not use patronage to get their way. Reporters deemed Harding unlikely to be nominated due to his poor showing in the primaries, and relegated him to a place among the dark horses. Harding, who like the other candidates was in Chicago supervising his campaign, had finished sixth in the final public opinion poll, behind the three main candidates as well as former Justice Hughes and Herbert Hoover, and only slightly ahead of Coolidge. After the convention dealt with other matters, the nominations for president opened on the morning of Friday, June 11. Harding had asked Willis T. average of 3.3% for the remainder of the decade. The misery index, which is a combination of unemployment and inflation, had its sharpest decline in U.S. history under Harding. Wages, profits, and productivity all made substantial gains. Annual GDP increases averaged at over 5% during the 1920s. Libertarian historians Larry Schweikert and Michael Allen argue that Mellon's tax policies set the stage for the most amazing growth yet seen in America's already impressive economy. Embracing new technologies. The 1920s were a time of modernization for America. Use of electricity became increasingly common. Mass production of the motor car stimulated other industries, as well, such as highway construction, rubber, steel, and building, as hotels were erected to accommodate the tourists venturing upon the roads. This economic boost helped bring the nation out of the recession. To improve and expand the nation's highway system, Harding signed the Federal Highway Act of 1921. From 1921 to 1923, the federal government spent $162 million on America's highway system, infusing the U.S. economy with a large amount of capital. In 1922, Harding proclaimed that America was in the age of the motor car, which reflects our standard of living and gauges the speed of our present-day life. Harding had urged regulation of radio broadcasting in his April 1921 speech to Congress. Commerce Secretary Hoover took charge of this project, and convened a conference of radio broadcasters in 1922, which led to a voluntary agreement for licensing of radio frequencies through the Commerce Department. Both Harding and Hoover realized something more than an agreement was needed, but Congress was slow to act, not imposing radio regulation until 1927. Harding also wished to promote aviation, and Hoover again took the lead, convening a national conference on commercial aviation. The discussions focused on safety matters, inspection of airplanes, and licensing of pilots. Harding again promoted legislation, but nothing was done until 1926, when the Air Commerce Act created the Bureau of Aeronautics within Hoover's Commerce Department. Business and labor. Harding's attitude toward business was that government should aid it as much as possible. He was suspicious of organized labor, viewing it as a conspiracy against business. He sought to get them to work together at a conference on unemployment that he called to meet in September 1921 at Hoover's recommendation. Harding warned in his opening address that no federal money would be available. No important legislation came as a result, though some public works projects were accelerated. Within broad limits, Harding allowed each cabinet secretary to run his department as he saw fit. Hoover expanded the Commerce Department to make it more useful to business. This was consistent with Hoover's view that the private sector should take the lead in managing the economy. Harding greatly respected his Commerce Secretary, often asked his advice, and backed him to the hilt, calling Hoover the smartest gink I know. Widespread strikes marked 1922, as labor sought redress for falling wages and increased unemployment. In April, 500,000 coal miners, led by John L. Lewis, struck over wage cuts. Mining executives argued that the industry was seeing hard times. Lewis accused them of trying to break the union. As the strike became protracted, Harding offered compromise to settle it. As Harding proposed, the miners agreed to return to work, and Congress created a commission to look into their grievances. On July 1, 1922, 400,000 railroad workers went on strike. Harding proposed a settlement that made some concessions, but management objected. Attorney General Dougherty convinced Judge James H. Wilkerson to issue a sweeping injunction to break up the strike. Although there was public support for the Wilkerson injunction, Harding felt it went too far, and had Dougherty and Wilkerson amend it. The injunction succeeded in ending the strike. However, tensions remained high between railroad workers and management for years. By 1922, the 8-hour day had become common in American industry. One exception was in steel mills, where workers labored through a 12-hour workday, 7 days a week. Hoover considered this practice barbaric, and got Harding to convene a conference of steel manufacturers with a view to ending it. The conference established a committee under the leadership of U.S. Steel Chairman Elbert Gary, which in early 1923 recommended against ending the practice. Harding sent a letter to Gary deploring the result, which was printed in the press, and public outcry caused the manufacturers to reverse themselves and standardize the 8-hour day. Civil rights and immigration. Although Harding's first address to Congress called for passage of anti-lynching legislation, he initially seemed inclined to do no more for African Americans than Republican presidents of the recent past had. He asked cabinet officers to find places for blacks in their departments. Sinclair suggested that the fact that Harding received 2/5 of the Southern vote in 1920 led him to see political opportunity for his party in the Solid South. On October 26, 1921, Harding gave a speech in Birmingham, Alabama, to a segregated audience of 20,000 whites and 10,000 blacks. Harding, while stating that the social and racial differences between whites and blacks could not be bridged, urged equal political rights for the African American. Many African Americans at that time voted Republican, especially in the Democratic South, and Harding stated he did not mind seeing that support end if the result was a strong two-party system in the South. He was willing to see literacy tests for voting continue, if applied fairly to white and black. Whether you like it or not, Harding told his segregated audience, unless our democracy is a lie, you must stand for that equality. The white section of the audience listened in silence while the black section cheered. Harding had spoken out against lynching in his April 1921 speech before Congress and supported Congressman Leonidas Dyer's federal anti-lynching bill, which passed the House of Representatives in January 1922. When it reached the Senate floor in November 1922, it was filibustered by Southern Democrats, and Lodge withdrew it so as to allow the ship subsidy bill Harding favored to be debated. It was likewise filibustered. Blacks blamed Harding for the Dyer bill's defeat. Harding biographer Robert K. Murray noted that it was hastened to its end by Harding's desire to have the ship subsidy bill considered. With the public suspicious of immigrants, especially those who might be socialists or communists, Congress passed the Presentum Act of 1921, signed by Harding on May 19, 1921, as a quick means of restricting immigration. The act reduced the numbers of immigrants to 3% of those from a given country living in the U.S., based on the 1910 census. This would, in practice, not restrict immigration from Ireland and Germany, but would bar many Italians and Eastern European Jews. Harding and Secretary of Labor James Davis believed that enforcement had to be humane, and at the Secretary's recommendation, Harding allowed almost 1,000 deportable immigrants to remain. Coolidge signed a bill permanently restricting immigration to the U.S. in 1924. Debs and political prisoners. Harding's socialist opponent in the 1920 election, Eugene Debs, was serving a 10-year sentence in the Atlanta penitentiary for speaking against the war. Wilson had refused to pardon him before leaving office. Dougherty met with Debs, and was deeply impressed. There was opposition from veterans, including the American Legion, and also from Florence Harding. The president did not feel he could release Debs until the war was officially over, but once the peace treaties were signed, commuted Debs' sentence on December 23, 1921. At Harding's request, Debs visited the president at the White House before going home to Indiana. Harding released 23 other war opponents at the same time as Debs, and continued to review cases and release political prisoners throughout his presidency. Harding defended his prisoner releases as necessary to return the nation to normalcy. Judicial appointments. Harding appointed 4 justices to the Supreme Court of the United States. When Chief Justice Edward Douglas White died in May 1921, Harding was unsure whether to appoint former President Taft or former Utah Senator George Sutherland. He had promised seats on the court to both men. After briefly considering awaiting another vacancy and appointing them both, he chose Taft as Chief Justice. Sutherland was appointed to the court in 1922, to be followed by 2 other economic conservatives, Pierce Butler and Edward Terry Sanford, in 1923. Harding also appointed 6 judges to the United States Courts of Appeals, 42 judges to the United States District Courts, and 2 judges to the United States Court of Customs Appeals. Final months, death and funeral. Political setbacks and Western tour. Entering the 1922 midterm congressional election campaign, Harding and the Republicans had followed through on many of their campaign promises. But some of the fulfilled pledges, like cutting taxes for the well-off, did not appeal to the electorate. The economy had not returned to normalcy, with unemployment at 11%, and organized labor angry over the outcome of the strikes. From 303 Republicans elected to the House in 1920, the new 68th Congress would see that party fall to a 221-213 majority. In the Senate, the Republicans lost 8 seats, and had 51 of 96 senators in the new Congress, which Harding did not survive to meet. A month after the election, the lame duck session of the old 67th Congress met. Harding had come to believe that his early view of the presidency that it should propose policies, but leave whether to adopt them to Congress was not enough, and he lobbied Congress, although in vain, to get his ship subsidy bill through. Once Congress left town in early March 1923, Harding's popularity in the country began to recover. The economy was improving, and the programs of Harding's more able cabinet members, such as Hughes, Mellon, and Hoover, were showing results. Most Republicans realized that there was no practical alternative to supporting Harding in 1924. In the first half of 1923, Harding did 2 acts that were later said to indicate foreknowledge of death. He sold the Star, though undertaking to remain as a contributing editor for 10 years after his presidency, and made a new will. Harding had long suffered occasional health problems, but when he was not experiencing symptoms he tended to eat, drink, and smoke too much. By 1919, he was aware he had a heart condition. Stress caused by the presidency and by Florence Harding's ill health, she had a chronic kidney condition, debilitated him, and he never really recovered from an episode of influenza in January 1923. After that, Harding, an avid golfer, had difficulty completing a round. In June 1923, Ohio Senator Willis met with Harding, but brought to the president's attention only 2 of the 5 items he intended to discuss. When asked why, Willis responded, "Warren seemed so tired." In June 1923, Harding set out on a journey, which he dubbed the Voyage of Understanding. The president planned to cross the country, go north to Alaska Territory, journey south along the west coast, then travel by Navy ship through the Panama Canal, to Puerto Rico, and to return to Washington at the end of August. Harding loved to travel and had long contemplated a trip to Alaska. The trip would allow him to speak widely across the country, to politic and bloviate in advance of the 1924 campaign, and allow him some rest away from Washington's oppressive summer heat. Harding's political advisers had given him a physically demanding schedule, even though the president had ordered it cut back. In Kansas City, Harding spoke on transportation issues. In Hutchinson, Kansas, agriculture was the theme. In Denver, he spoke on prohibition, and continued west, making a series of speeches not matched by any president until Franklin Roosevelt. Harding had become a supporter of the World Court, and wanted the U.S. to become a member. In addition to making speeches, he visited Yellowstone and Zion National Parks, and dedicated a monument on the Oregon Trail at a celebration organized by Venerable Pioneer Ezra Meeker and others. On July 5, Harding embarked on USS Henderson in Washington state. The first president to visit Alaska, he spent hours watching the dramatic landscapes from the deck of the Henderson. After several stops along the coast, the presidential party left the ship at Seward to take the Alaska Central Railway to McKinley Park and Fairbanks, where he addressed a crowd of 1,594 degrees Fahrenheit, 34 degrees Celsius, heat. The party was to return to Seward by the Richardson Trail, but due to Harding's fatigue, it went by train. On July 26, 1923, Harding toured Vancouver, British Columbia as the first sitting American president to visit Canada. He was welcomed by the Premier of British Columbia and the Mayor of Vancouver and spoke to a crowd of over 50,000. 2 years after his death, a memorial to Harding was unveiled in Stanley Park. Harding visited a golf course, but completed only 6 holes before being fatigued. After resting, he played the 17th and 18th holes, so it would appear he completed the round. He was not successful in hiding his exhaustion. One reporter deemed him so tired a rest of mere days would not be sufficient to refresh him. In Seattle the next day, Harding kept up his busy schedule, giving a speech to 25,000 people at the stadium at the University of Washington. In the final speech he gave, Harding predicted statehood for Alaska. The president rushed through his speech, not waiting for applause by the audience. Death in San Francisco, funeral, and memorial. Harding went to bed early in the evening of July 27, 1923. Later that night, he called for his physician, Charles E. Sawyer, complaining of pain in the upper abdomen. Sawyer thought it was a recurrence of a dietary upset, but Dr. Joel T. Boone suspected a heart problem. The next day, as the train rushed to San Francisco, Harding felt better, and when they arrived on the morning of July 29, 1923, he insisted on walking from the train to the car, which rushed him to the Palace Hotel, where he suffered a relapse. Doctors found that not only was Harding's heart causing problems, but he also had pneumonia, a serious matter in the days before effective antibiotics. When treated with caffeine and digitalis, Harding seemed to improve. He was pleased when his planned foreign policy address advocating membership in the World Court was released to the press by Hoover and received a favorable reception. By the afternoon of August 2, 1923, doctors allowed Harding to sit up in bed. That evening, about 7:30 p.m., he was listening to his wife read him a flattering article about him from the Saturday Evening Post, a calm review of a calm man. When she paused to plump his pillows, he said, "That's good, read some more." As Florence Harding resumed, her husband twisted convulsively and collapsed, and she raced to get the doctors. They attempted stimulants, but were unable to revive him, and President Harding died of a heart attack on August 2, 1923, at the age of 57. His death was initially attributed to a cerebral hemorrhage, as doctors at the time did not generally understand the symptoms of a heart attack. Harding's death came as a great shock to the nation. The president was liked and admired, and the press and public had followed his illness closely, and been reassured by his apparent recovery. Harding was returned to his train in a casket for a journey across the nation followed closely in the newspapers. 9 million people lined the tracks as Harding's body was taken from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., and after services there, home to Marion, Ohio, for burial. In Marion, the body of Warren Harding was placed on a horse-drawn hearse, which was followed by President Coolidge and Chief Justice Taft, then by Harding's wife and father. They followed it through the city, past the Star Building where the presses stood silent, and at last to the Marion Cemetery, where the casket was placed in the cemetery's receiving vault. Harding's body, along with that of his wife who died in 1924, rests today in the Harding Tomb, which was dedicated in 1931 by President Hoover. Scandals. Harding appointed a number of friends and acquaintances to federal positions. Some served competently, such as Charles E. Sawyer, the Harding's personal physician from Marion who attended to them in the White House. Sawyer alerted Harding to the Veterans Bureau scandal. Others proved ineffective in office, such as Daniel R. Crissinger, a Marion lawyer whom Harding made controller of the currency and later a governor of the Federal Reserve Board, or Harding's old friend, director of the Mint Frank Scobie, who Trani and Wilson noted did little damage during his tenure. Harding's brother-in-law Heber H. Votoff, superintendent of federal prisons, was unable to root out the drug trade from within the facilities. Others of these associates proved corrupt and were later dubbed the Ohio Gang. Most of the scandals that have marred the reputation of Harding's administration did not emerge until after his death. The Veterans Bureau scandal was known to Harding in January 1923 but, according to Trani and Wilson, the president's handling of it did him little credit. Harding allowed the corrupt director of the Bureau, Charles R. Forbes, to flee to Europe, though he later returned and served prison time. Harding had learned that Dougherty's factotum at the Justice Department, Jess Smith, was involved in corruption. The president ordered Dougherty to get Smith out of Washington and removed his name from the upcoming presidential trip to Alaska. Smith committed suicide on May 30, 1923. It is uncertain how much Harding knew about Smith's illicit activities. Murray noted that Harding was not involved in the corruption and did not condone it. Hoover accompanied Harding on the Western trip and later wrote that Harding asked then what Hoover would do if he knew of some great scandal, whether to publicize it or bury it. Hoover replied that Harding should publish and get credit for integrity, and asked for details. Harding stated that it had to do with Smith but, when Hoover inquired as to Dougherty's possible involvement, Harding refused to answer. Teapot Dome. The scandal which has likely done the greatest damage to Harding's reputation is Teapot Dome. Like most of the administration's scandals, it came to light after Harding's death, and he was not aware of the illegal aspects. Teapot Dome involved an oil reserve in Wyoming which was one of 3 set aside for the use of the Navy in a national emergency. There was a long-standing argument that the reserves should be developed. Wilson's first Interior Secretary Franklin Knight Lane was an advocate of this position. When the Harding administration took office, Interior Secretary Fall took up Lane's argument and Harding signed an executive order in May 1921 transferring the reserves from the Navy Department to Interior. This was done with the consent of Navy Secretary Edwin C. Denby. The Interior Department announced in July 1921 that Edward Doheny had been awarded a lease to drill along the edges of Naval Reserve Elk Hills in California. The announcement attracted little controversy, as the oil would have been lost to wells on adjacent private land. Wyoming Senator John Kendrick had heard from constituents that Teapot Dome had also been leased, but no announcement had been made. The Interior Department refused to provide documentation, so he secured the passage of a Senate resolution compelling disclosure. The department sent a copy of the lease granting drilling rights to Harry Sinclair's Mammoth Oil Company, along with a statement that there had been no competitive bidding because military preparedness was involved. Mammoth was to build oil tanks for the Navy as part of the deal. This satisfied some people, but some conservationists, such as Gifford Pinchot, Harry A. Slattery, and others, pushed for a full investigation into Fall and his activities. They got Wisconsin Senator Robert M. La Follette Sr. to begin a Senate investigation into the oil leases. La Follette persuaded Democratic Montana Senator Thomas J. Walsh to lead the investigation, and Walsh read through the truckload of material provided by the Interior Department through 1922 into 1923, including a letter from Harding stating that the transfer and leases had been with his knowledge and approval. Hearings into Teapot Dome began in October 1923, after Harding's death. Fall had left office earlier that year, but he denied receiving any money from Sinclair or Doheny. Sinclair agreed. The following month, Walsh learned that Fall had spent lavishly on expanding and improving his New Mexico ranch. Fall reappeared and stated that the money had come as a loan from Harding's friend and the Washington Post publisher Edward B. McLean, but McLean denied it when he testified. Doheny told the committee that he had given Fall the money in cash as a personal loan out of regard for their past association, but Fall invoked the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination when he was compelled to appear again, rather than answer questions. Investigators found that Fall and a relative had received a total of about $400,000 from Doheny and Sinclair, and that the transfers were contemporaneous with the controversial leases. Fall was ultimately convicted in 1929 for accepting bribes and, in 1931, became the first U.S. cabinet member to be imprisoned for crimes committed while in office. Sinclair was convicted only of contempt of court for jury tampering. Doheny was brought to trial before a jury in April 1930 for giving the bribe Fall had been convicted of accepting, but he was acquitted. Justice Department. Harding's appointment of Harry M. Doherty as Attorney General received more criticism than any other. Doherty's Ohio lobbying and backroom maneuvers were not considered to qualify him for his office. When the scandals broke in 1923 and 1924, Doherty's many enemies were delighted at the prospect of connecting him with the dishonesty, and assumed he had taken part in Teapot Dome, though Fall and Doherty were not friends. In February 1924, the Senate voted to investigate the Justice Department, where Doherty remained Attorney General. Democratic Montana Senator Burton K. Wheeler was on the investigating committee and assumed the role of prosecutor when hearings began on March 12, 1924. Jess Smith had engaged in influence peddling before his suicide, conspiring with two other Ohioans, Howard Mannington and Fred A. Caskey, to accept payoffs from alcohol bootleggers to secure either immunity from prosecution or the release of liquor from government warehouses. Mannington and Caskey's residence became infamous as the Little Greenhouse on K Street. Some witnesses, such as Smith's divorced wife Roxy Stinson, and corrupt former FBI agent Gaston Means, alleged that Doherty was personally involved. Coolidge requested Doherty's resignation when the Attorney General indicated that he would not allow Wheeler's committee access to Justice Department records, and Doherty complied on March 28, 1924. The illicit activity that caused Doherty the most problems was a Smith deal with Colonel Thomas W. Miller, a former Delaware congressman, whom Harding had appointed alien property custodian. Smith and Miller received a payoff of almost $500,000 for getting a German-owned firm, the American Metal Company, released to new U.S. owners. Smith deposited $50,000 in a joint account with Doherty, used for political purposes. Records relating to that account were destroyed by Doherty and his brother. Miller and Doherty were indicted for defrauding the government. The first trial, in September 1926, resulted in a hung jury. At the second, early in 1927, Miller was convicted and served prison time, but the jury again hung as to Doherty. Though charges against Doherty were then dropped, and he was never convicted of any offense, his refusal to take the stand in his own defense devastated what was left of his reputation. The former Attorney General remained defiant, blaming his troubles on his enemies in the labor movement and on the communists, and wrote that he had done nothing that prevents my looking the whole world in the face. Veterans Bureau. Charles R. Forbes, the energetic director of the Veterans Bureau, sought to consolidate control of veterans' hospitals and their construction in his bureau. At the start of Harding's presidency, this power was vested in the Treasury Department. The politically powerful American Legion backed Forbes and denigrated those who opposed him, like Secretary Mellon, and in April 1922, Harding agreed to transfer control to the Veterans Bureau. Forbes' main task was to ensure that new hospitals were built around the country to help the 300,000 wounded World War I veterans. Near the beginning of 1922, Forbes had met Elias Mortimer, agent for the Thompson Black Construction Company of St. Louis, which wanted to construct the hospitals. The two men became close, and Mortimer paid for Forbes' travels through the West, looking at potential hospital sites for the wounded World War I veterans. Forbes was also friendly with Charles F. Hurley, owner of the Hurley Mason Construction Company of Washington State. Harding had ordered that all contracts be pursuant to public notice, but the three worked out a deal whereby the two companies would get the contracts with the profits divided three ways. Some of the money went to the Bureau's chief counsel, Charles F. Kramer. Forbes defrauded the government in this hospital construction, increasing construction costs from $3,000 to $4,000 per bed. A tenth of the inflated construction billings was set aside for the conspirators, with Forbes receiving a third of the take. The graft then spread to land acquisition, with Forbes authorizing the purchase of a San Francisco tract that was worth less than $20,000 for $105,000. At least $25,000 of the resulting financial excess was divided between Forbes and Kramer. Intent on making more money, Forbes in November 1922 began selling valuable hospital supplies under his control in large warehouses at the Perryville Depot in Maryland. The government had stockpiled huge quantities of hospital supplies during the First World War, which Forbes unloaded for a fraction of their cost to the Boston firm of Thompson and Kelly at a time when the Veterans Bureau was buying supplies for the hospitals at a much higher price. The check on Forbes' authority at Perryville was Dr. Sawyer, Harding's physician and chairman of the Federal Hospitalization Board. Sawyer told Harding that Forbes was selling valuable hospital supplies to an insider contractor. At first Harding did not believe it, but Sawyer secured proof in January 1923. A shocked Harding, who alternated between rage and despondency over the corruption in his administration, summoned Forbes to the White House and demanded his resignation. Harding did not want an open scandal and allowed Forbes to flee to Europe, from where he resigned on February 15, 1923. In spite of Harding's efforts, gossip about Forbes' activities resulted in the Senate ordering an investigation 2 weeks later, and in mid-March, Kramer committed suicide. Mortimer was willing to tell all, as Forbes had had an affair with his wife, which also broke up the Forbes marriage. The construction executive was the star witness at the hearings in late 1923, after Harding's death. Forbes returned from Europe to testify, but convinced few, and in 1924, he and John W. Thompson, of Thompson Black, were tried in Chicago for conspiracy to defraud the government. Both were convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Forbes began to serve his sentence in 1926. Thompson, who had a bad heart, died that year before commencing his. According to Trani and Wilson, one of the most troublesome aspects of the Harding presidency was that he appeared to be far more concerned with political liabilities of a scandal than in securing justice. Extramarital affairs. Harding had an extramarital affair with Carrie Fulton Phillips of Marion, which lasted about 15 years before ending in 1920. Letters from Harding to Phillips were discovered by Harding biographer Francis Russell in the possession of Marion attorney Donald Williamson while Russell was researching his book in 1963. Before that, the affair was not generally known. Williamson donated the letters to the Ohio Historical Society. Some there wanted the letters destroyed to preserve what remained of Harding's reputation. A lawsuit ensued, with Harding's heirs claiming copyright over the letters. The case was ultimately settled in 1971, with the letters donated to the Library of Congress. They were sealed until 2014, but before their opening, historians used copies at Case Western Reserve University and in Russell's papers at the University of Wyoming. Russell concluded from the letters that Phillips was the love of Harding's life, the enticements of his mind and body combined in one person, but historian Justin P. Coffey in his 2014 review of Harding biographies criticizes him for obsess over Harding's sex life. The allegations of Harding's other known mistress, Nan Britton, long remained uncertain. In 1927, Britton, also a Marionite, published The President's Daughter, Al.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.